mother that herself may have had problems as a fetus in utero knows about these problems and has evolved compensatory mechanisms to cope with this problem, transmits that know-how through her mitochondria onto her offspring.
Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
From stem cells to mapping the brain and medical ethics, we hope to give you a glimpse of the bright future ahead through discussions with some of the people making it happen. Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode. This week we spoke to Professor Dino Giussani about how our environment in utero can affect our risk of disease in adult life, which is something we call programming. In particular, we spoke about how hypoxia can program for cardiovascular disease, which is Dino's particular area of expertise. We also discussed how antioxidant therapies might be a future solution to this problem. We take a deep dive into this topic, and our discussion takes us everywhere from Nazi-occupied Europe to the Andean mountains in Bolivia, as Dino takes us through an incredibly interesting area of biology, which has actually shaped the entirety of human health throughout our history. So without further ado, we really hope you enjoy the episode. And we're live. Professor Giussani, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to this.
I'm really looking forward to this. So just to set the scene of what we're planning on speaking about, we're planning on talking about cardiovascular disease. Ultimately, we're going to talk about how even events before your birth can affect the extent to which cardiovascular disease is likely to develop in adult life, which is incredibly fascinating. Perhaps we could start off, actually I hadn't planned on talking about this, but you could talk to us about how you became interested in this area of research in general, sort of the story of your research.
Well, it does delve into cardiovascular disease itself. I became interested in a problem that was significant to society, and the sad truth is that cardiovascular diseases of the heart and the circulation are really one of the greatest killers in the world today. If you even look at statistics from the British Heart Foundation, you will find that alarmingly, 1 in 3 people die of cardiovascular disease. Every 3 minutes, someone has a heart attack, and of those, 30% are fatal. So there is no question then that cardiovascular disease is a significant problem. It's an expensive as well as an important problem to resolve, and it drains, it's a significant contribution to our nation's health and wealth. So I wanted to study and investigate something that would hopefully contribute to ameliorating this big problem that we have still today.
So the goals you set in terms of your research really spawned out of wanting to have an effect instead of an inherent interest in the biology. Is that fair to say?
That is correct. And I think when we think about cardiovascular disease, of course, there have been significant improvements in terms of treatment, which have benefited society for a number of years. But again, the sad truth is that we need to change the way that we think about cardiovascular disease from treatment towards intervention, and try to look back at what specific circumstances are really increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. And this is how we get onto this idea of developmental programming going as early as possible to try and sort resolve the problem at its very origin, if you like.
And I suppose even though we hear about heart attacks happening all the time, it really helps to put it into perspective how huge a problem this is for the country and for the world.
That's right.
And would you agree that it's perhaps a growing problem, considering?
I think it is very much a growing problem. When we think about heart disease, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is this interaction between our genetic makeup and environmental risk factors such as smoking, obesity, and a sedentary life. And of course, now we become more sedentary, and also there is a growing epidemic, if you like, of obesity, and hence it is easy to see how the problem is getting worse and worse and worse. And we are becoming a greater risk year by year of suffering greater causes of cardiovascular disease.
Is research into cardiovascular disease proportional to the scale of the problem it is in our public health? I wonder.
It's an interesting question. I think it is comparable, I think, to the amount of research that goes into cancer. So I do think that there are a huge number of resources, but as always, of course, we like some more, and I think that's in this country that's been championed really by the British Heart Foundation, and they have done an enormous amount to against the fight of cardiovascular disease.
So sort of raise awareness and raise the appropriate funding to.
That's right. It is raise awareness, raise capital to flood into research to try and develop more therapeutic strategies, as well as thinking about novel ways of intervening as early as possible. And
you've mentioned two very important ideas to consider when we're thinking about the development of cardiovascular disease: our genes and the environment. And I think people have some understanding of the way that you behave and the way that your environment can affect your health and like your cardiovascular health. So smoking, people understand that smoking might not be good for your cardiovascular system. But I'd like to talk a bit about this idea of programming and how that is different from other environmental factors. So could you explain that to some extent?
Sure. I mean, it's a really interesting concept because now we've become aware that it's not only a gene-environment interaction that might predispose to cardiovascular disease, but it is the environment before birth that may be just, if not more important, in interacting with your genetic makeup to set a risk of cardiovascular disease. So that is to say how adverse conditions during pregnancy may interact with the genetic makeup of the unborn baby to set a future risk of cardiovascular disease. And if you think about it, that makes a huge amount of sense, because our physiology, what makes us function, is so much more plastic, so much more malleable in early life. So you can imagine that a challenge to the environment when the baby is forming its heart and developing its vasculature at a really sensitive and critical period of development may of course have long-term consequences for the cardiovascular health of that individual. So it is really thinking about how adverse conditions during pregnancy can interact with genes to trigger a future risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's what this idea of developmental programming really dictates.
And it's interesting to think about how, like you said, these systems aren't well developed during development, because that's what they're doing, they're developing. Right. And that's what makes them so much more susceptible to being affected by all these environmental factors.
It makes a huge amount of sense, doesn't it? And I think we've always known, for instance, that smoking in pregnancy is a bad thing, and that competes with the amount of oxygen the baby is obtaining, if you like, and of course that's a bad thing during fetal development. Similarly, I think we've always known that drinking alcohol during pregnancy may be problematic, and it's easy to understand about that. But I think these new ideas are really focusing, for instance, on alterations in maternal nutrition and the maternal nutritional status, and how that can impact on the developing heart and the developing blood vessels to again trigger a future risk of cardiovascular disease in later life. And I think some of the human evidence to support those concepts have stemmed back from really interesting observations. For example, during the Second World War and with the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, there was really a period of imposed nutritional rations in people, a large number of whom were expectant mothers, for instance. And this is called the Dutch famine. And now we know from epidemiological studies that have related or looked at the cardiovascular health of adult individuals, adult men and women who, suffered periods of undernutrition when they were in the womb, when their mothers were undergoing this famine, have themselves found, we have found that they have increased blood pressure and increased indices of heart disease. And those were really one of the first observations that linked, if you like, alterations in maternal nutrition, in this case significant maternal malnutrition or undernutrition, with future risk of hypertension in later life.
So this experiment we're talking about took place over decades, really, because you had to wait for these babies to become adults to see these effects.
That's right. I mean, they're almost historical events, and sadly, experiments of human nature, if you like, of how we came to stumble onto this. But most recently, actually, there's been another example, and it's almost looking at the other end of the spectrum, where the focus has changed from maternal undernutrition to maternal overnutrition.
Something perhaps more relevant to society today.
To society today, that's right. With the increasing prevalence of obesity, we have another alarming statistic that has come through only in the last few months that state that more women are obese than not in the UK. And that's really an alarming statistic, which suggests that women of normal weight have become actually a minority. And of course, that also includes a number of women of reproductive age who may fall pregnant and therefore have an obese pregnancy that might then increase the risk of a future individual to cardiovascular disease. And that's interesting to think about because, people might say, well, obese parents might have obese children because of genetic factors, which is true, or because of environmental influences and habits, which is also true. But the interesting point is that now we're finding that newborn babies or children before the age of 5 from obese pregnancies or born from obese pregnancies are themselves now at increased risk of having cardiovascular disease markers. And that really points out to something within the obesogenic environment, if you like, that the baby, again, has been developing in. This may be, an inflammatory environment, an oxidative stress environment that's impacting on the developing heart and the circulation. There is an interesting, again, human clinical study that have compared the offspring of women from the same family before and after bariatric surgery to, of course, control obesity. And what I think the results showed is that the child born before bariatric surgery was more at risk of having cardiovascular disease than the child born after bariatric surgery within the same family. So that really then provides strong evidence in humans that the environment in which you are developing in, even within the same womb, can literally influence the long-term health of your heart and circulation.
I'd be interested to learn a bit about were there any effects on other systems?
There are. In addition to the cardiovascular system being affected, there are other systems that are affected, for example, those that control metabolism, as well as blood sugar regulation, for example, developing type 2 diabetes, and not able to regulate the amount of sugar in their blood accordingly. So it's sort of, this whole syndrome, if you like, that is being programmed has been coined as sort of a cardiometabolic syndrome that is contributing to this great drain on health.
And it speaks to how linked, our metabolic systems and your cardiovascular health really are. When I first learned about this, I always conceptualized it as the fetus was preparing for an environment where not much nutrition was going to be available.
That's right. I mean, those were the first ideas that came about, as to say that if you're developing in a harsh environment, an adverse or a suboptimal intrauterine environment, then you adapt to that environment in a way that you might, harness your energy and prepare yourself in a way for the same environment later in life. That is to say, if you're born from an undernourished pregnancy, you might, program yourself to a life of malnutrition later in life. And then, of course, what might happen later on is that prediction is mismatched. And, a baby that has suddenly evolved mechanisms to cope with not much sugar or fat or protein suddenly finds itself in a sort of cafeteria diet. And, of course, that's where the mismatch yields to pathology and dysfunction.
Yeah. But I think it's very interesting, and I just think it's very clever, to be honest with you.
Yeah. it is remarkably clever for the unborn child to sort of be able to predict, what best chance of life you might have decades later.
Yeah,
that is clever, yes.
And without wanting to get too molecular, a lot of the effects are due to chemical changes which happen to DNA. So you're not actually changing the DNA, but you're changing how the DNA is essentially processed to make proteins.
That's absolutely correct. It's you're not changing the genetic code. You're simply affecting things that might be expressed in a different way.
How does the fetus respond to hypoxia?
Well, hypoxia means a lack of oxygen, and because we have no long-term storage of oxygen in our systems, whether you're in fetal life, if you like, as opposed to say glucose or fat, then you have to respond to it very, very quickly in order to maintain life. So when the fetus has an episode of hypoxia, it can really do only a couple of things. It is, the fetus can either make best use of the available oxygen supply, or you can reduce oxygen consumption. And interestingly, one of the main consumers of oxygen is the fetal heart. So what the fetus does is to reduce its heart rate. We call that a bradycardia, and that decreases oxygen consumption by the heart, sparing it, if you like. And then we can then use that spared oxygen to drive it to hypoxia-sensitive tissues like the brain and the developing cardiovascular system, the developing central nervous system, shifting it away from less essential vascular beds such as the peripheral circulation. So that's known as the fetal brain sparing effect, or a redistribution of blood flow away from the periphery towards the brain.
So some organs need a more constant supply of oxygen than others, some tissues?
I think all organs need oxygen, but I think if you have to ration that oxygen, then you're going to distribute it to the most important organs, maintaining their metabolism at the expense of shutting down basically less important organs. Yes.
And this response is different to what happens in adults when we're hypoxic.
That's correct, because in adult life, after birth, basically one of the things that we can do that we can't do, of course, in fetal life is to ventilate our lungs with oxygen. So what happens in adult life is that we increase our ventilatory rate, so we obtain more oxygen. And then the cardiovascular strategy has to be switched to match that increased ventilation, which again makes complete sense, because then what you want to do is to drive this newly oxygenated blood to all areas that are becoming hypoxic. So it's almost what we call the sort of luxurious response to hypoxia in adult life, where then what we do is we increase heart rate, which contributes to an increase in cardiac output. And then we drive this newly oxygenated blood to all areas of our body, including the less essential vascular beds that also vasodilate. So it's a very different response than we have in fetal life.
I suppose the fetus is having to improvise a bit more because it's got fewer resources available.
Exactly that. And I think what we've now learned is that although that is an adaptive response to hypoxia, a compensatory response to hypoxia, this redistribution of blood flow away from the peripheral circulations towards the brain, it can become maladaptive if the period of hypoxia becomes prolonged. Every pregnancy that may be complicated by an increase in placental vascular resistance will, of course, decrease blood flow to the fetus and thereby oxygen delivery, causing reductions in oxygenation, or what we call hypoxia. So chronic hypoxia in the fetus then is quite a common challenge, which stems from a number of pregnancy adverse conditions. So that's one way in which the fetus can become hypoxic, which is, of course, a great number of pregnancies and an important problem. But another is, of course, when the mother herself may be hypoxic, have reduced oxygenation, and thereby then the baby has less oxygen. And one of the most common situations for that is in maternal respiratory disease. So even quite mild disease, such as obstructive sleep apnea, might lead to periods of maternal desaturation or episodes of hypoxia, which might then translate into episodes of hypoxia in the baby. But of course also pregnancy at high altitude. So we now know, I think, a statistic that with the expanding world population, a number of people are being driven to populate more high altitude areas. So we know that in high altitude pregnancy, one of the most common outcomes is a reduction in birth weight. But the other, perhaps less investigated adverse consequence of chronic hypoxia comes back to this brain sparing effect in the fetal circulation, because and that can become maladaptive in a number of ways. So in the short term it can be beneficial, but in the long term it might, for instance, decrease the development of peripheral organs, such as a skeletal muscle, for instance, such as the pancreas. And the number of these beta cells that we have in the annulates of Langerhans is set at birth. So if you have a challenge that is going to reduce, if you like, the development of the pancreas, the proliferation of these cells, then your endowment of beta cells is going to be reduced even from birth. And therefore you can see that will, of course, trigger in later life a problem with regulating blood sugar, with perhaps insufficient number of cells that are going to secrete insulin, for instance.
It's essentially causing damage which can't be undone.
That's right.
Are there some mothers who are more susceptible to this than others?
Yes, it's really interesting, actually. So a number of years ago, we did a study in La Paz and Santa Cruz, which are two cities in Bolivia, a South American country, which is right in the middle of South America. And Bolivia is a really interesting country to study because it is divided by the Andean mountain range, the Andean Cordillera, into areas of two halves, if you like. So to the west of the country, you have areas of a very high altitude, and one of them is La Paz, which stands at about 4,000 meters, about 12,000 feet, one of the highest capital cities in the world. And as the country spans into the Brazilian Amazon, then there are a number of sea level cities, and one of the largest, the second largest city of Bolivia is Santa Cruz, which stands at sea level. So a number of years ago, we wrote a grant to collaborate with the Bolivian Institute for High Altitude Biology, and collaborated with Bolivian cardiologists as well as obstetricians to try and see whether the chronic hypoxia of high altitude would lower birth weight at a populational level. But in addition, we wanted to study another unique thing about Bolivia, and that is that it's a country that is populated by people from very different ancestry. So you have the Andeans, the people who are Aymara and Quechua, who are really the descendants of the Incas, if you like, who've been at high altitude for generational times. And you have a high also European admixture. So we were also interested in the impact of a high altitude residence ancestry on birth weight. And what we found is that, of course, at high altitude, birth weight is reduced, as we expected to find relative to babies born in Santa Cruz, which was quite an impact in the degree of birth weight reduction at high altitude was quite significant. So if it was of the order of about 600 to 900 grams in a baby that is normally born at about 3.5 kilograms. We also found that at high altitude, the prevalence of babies born less than 2.5 kilos, which is defined as clinically significant fetal growth restriction, was markedly elevated, of the order of about 12%. When this is in completely healthy pregnancies of non-smoking mothers that reach term, if you like, and it just been born at high altitude. But the interesting finding on top of that was that babies who are born from Andean mothers were in La Paz relative to mothers from European admixture. Babies born from Andean mothers were heavier than babies born from mothers of European ancestry. So that really surprised us, particularly in Bolivia, because unfortunately Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in the world. It is a developing country, a developing society, and families of Andean ancestry are highly impoverished, which means that there is a high degree of maternal malnutrition during pregnancy. So we expected, in fact, for babies born from Andean mothers at high altitude to have a double whammy effect, if you like, and for them to be most at risk of being born small. But in fact, we found that they were born heavier than mothers from European ancestry.
So their resistance to the hypoxia outweighed the nutritional component.
That's exactly right, and what we think. We thought that clearly, having been at high altitude for generational times, had triggered an adaptive response, a compensatory response that and that protected against fetal growth restriction, and that the protection was in fact so significant that it overwhelmed the very powerful effect that we know malnutrition can have in lowering birth weight.
Wow, I mean, you think about birth weight, you think about nutrition, and the fact that the hypoxic effect was even greater just shows how profoundly this programming can affect the newborn.
And that's it. That's exactly right. And of course, we started really honing into what was it about, this. What do we actually mean by this Andean protection against birth weight at high altitude and protecting against chronic hypoxia? And we have done some more work on that and looked at Andean placentas. And we have found, in fact, that they have a greater expression of what we call antioxidant enzymes in them that protect against oxidative stress. Basically, oxidative stress describes really how free radicals, which are molecules with unpaired electrons, might actually influence the physiology of the baby, the way that it's developing. And it seems that under chronic hypoxic conditions, there is an elevation in these free radicals that lead to oxidative stress that can be dangerous to development. And Mother Nature has adapted to that by endowing the Andean placenta with a greater expression of antioxidant enzymes to protect against this elevated oxidative stress. So it is really quite a remarkable story.
What can be done to combat oxidative stress in utero?
I've always believed that one has to pay attention to Mother Nature. And the observations between Andean women and European women in La Paz at high altitude made me believe that oxidative stress is important, and perhaps one way to resolve the problem is to increase the antioxidant capacity during pregnancy, to supplement, if you like, the antioxidant enzymes that we have naturally. So we have done some experiments recently where we have treated pregnancies complicated by chronic hypoxia with antioxidants. And one of these antioxidants that we used was vitamin C, which is an antioxidant vitamin. And what we found was that protected against fetal growth restriction in these problematic pregnancies. And most interestingly, it also protected against a future risk of hypertension in later life. So it is one of the first studies where we have successful intervention to try and ameliorate programmed cardiovascular disease in later life that stems from prenatal adverse conditions during pregnancy.
And I suppose as this field becomes better fleshed out, eventually we might be in a situation where antioxidants are given to mothers who are potentially at risk of having hypoxic offspring.
That's right. I think it is difficult to translate this to the human clinical situation in a very safe way, which is what we must do, absolutely. And one of the major challenges is, of course, to try and identify those pregnancies that have low oxygenation in utero. Because what we found in some of our experiments is that antioxidant supplementation was protective against fetal growth restriction and future hypertension in the adult offspring, but only in pregnancies which were chronically hypoxic. And when the antioxidant supplementation was given to healthy pregnancies, we in fact found that some of the adverse consequences mimicked the effect of chronic fetal hypoxia.
That's very interesting, and also something I wouldn't have expected at all. What you're saying is too much antioxidant has the same effect as hypoxia.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of summarize it as always as too much of a good thing always becomes a bad thing. But what we mean in this specific circumstance is that when you give antioxidants, what they do is to increase the nitric oxide bioavailability in too high a way, if you like. So, and we now know that excess nitric oxide can also lead to oxidative stress. So it's all a question of balance and equilibrium. So then that begs the question as to how do you identify which pregnancies should be treated and which pregnancies should not. The only current way to do that is by tracking fetal growth, which we can only do really at the 20th week check of pregnancy, if you like. And if that baby is not growing well, then of course we have to repeat the tracking of fetal growth and repeat the scans. And you might be able to identify a pregnancy that may be deemed appropriate for antioxidant treatment, perhaps after the 25th week of pregnancy. And what that then suggests is that what we need to do is to design therapies to rescue the effect of chronic hypoxia rather than to prevent it. And I think the type of experimental designs that we're thinking about at the moment is exactly that, is how late can you let the problem develop before you can successfully rescue it. We are aware that perhaps it's much better to treat a newborn baby from a hypoxic pregnancy or from an obese pregnancy with antioxidants rather than to treat the fetus in utero via the mother, because you are treating two patients as opposed to one. So those are the ideas that are currently ongoing. Is how much can we wait before the disease process has become irreversible?
And I'm sure that now that you've done this research, which has uncovered this effect that antioxidants can have, these are the questions which must be on your mind all the time currently.
All the time. I mean, we have found that people identify with vitamin C because it's, of course, something that a lot of people take every day as who are health conscious, as a healthy thing. But in our experience, we found that vitamin C is quite a weak antioxidant, and you really have to give quite large concentrations of it to have an effect. So it really isn't that translatable to the human clinical situation. So in our minds at the moment, the most pressing questions are, can we identify antioxidants that may be better to implement in human clinical practice, and at which stage of the developmental process can we actually treat successfully? And at the moment we are thinking about novel antioxidants, new discovered antioxidants, which are called mitochondria-targeted antioxidants, that may be quite focused in the way that they may act and thereby have the least number of adverse side effects, if you like. So that's proven an interesting avenue.
Watch this space, I suppose.
Watch this space.
Do you get satisfaction from knowing that this work, very indirectly, you won't really encounter the people who are going to be benefiting from this in the future? Do you get satisfaction from knowing that you will be the work will be benefiting people?
Yes, I think in the science that I do, you have to be an eternal optimist and also have a very long-term perspective to bear fruit to your investment, if you like. You're absolutely right. I don't think antioxidant supplementation in adverse pregnancy will become common practice in the next 10 years. I think it'll become common practice perhaps in decades to come. And of course, we have to wait generations to actually determine whether it's been successful or not.
Are there factors outside of hypoxia in which you'd like to perhaps one day study the effects they have on programming?
Very much so. I think one of the interesting ideas at the moment is that there are these conditions that lead to excess stress, and stressful conditions during pregnancy, and there have been human studies that have linked babies born from stress pregnancies. For instance, in the 9/11 catastrophe, that where women were pregnant during that experience. Now, several years later, people have found that their offspring also have cardiovascular problems and metabolic problems, which have linked, what is it about the stressful pregnancy that may have programmed these adverse consequences later in life.
Could you talk to us a bit about intergenerational programming?
Yes, I think this is a really interesting idea where what we've now found is that problems in the cardiovascular system in individuals that have been programmed in utero, as we've discussed through developmental programming processes, can actually be transmitted across generations, even when the second generation pregnancy is healthy. So what that really impacts on then is it is not only important what your mother ate during pregnancy or how much oxygen her womb was receiving, but it's also important as to how much your grandmother ate during pregnancy or how healthy her pregnancy was. So, again, it expands this window of perspective to really, quite a number of generations.
Really grows the tree, doesn't it? Yeah.
It really arborizes to and it's difficult to conceptualize, but it's very, very interesting.
Next time it's your grand's birthday, give her a ring and be like,
That's right.
What was the environment like around then?
That's right.
I need to know for my health.
And one way to think about as to how this may be possible and what are the mechanisms that may be driving this is again through epigenetic processes. So we can actually inherit not only risk of disease but also protection against it. And a nice story, I think, for women that get a bad rap nowadays for smoking during pregnancy or drinking alcohol during pregnancy or being obese during pregnancy, is that in one latest experiment we found that what a mother can actually do is to adapt as a fetus to a challenge, a future mother as a female fetus to a challenge in a way that it can cope with the challenge, and not only that, but transmit onto her offspring a future protective trait against cardiovascular disease.
I see. So if a woman develops in an in utero environment where her mother is smoking, for example, she could then transmit to her offspring a resistance to that.
That's right. So, well, in fact, if you're a male fetus or a female fetus from a pregnancy that is complicated, for instance, by smoking or hypoxia, what happens is that might imprint a problem into the cardiovascular system, in the developing cardiovascular system of that fetus, but also that fetus might trigger compensatory responses to try and mitigate that problem. So you develop, if you like, both adverse conditions or an increased risk of suffering disease later in life, as well as sort of developing a protection against it. Now, although both male and fetuses might develop both these traits, only the protective trait can be transmitted to the future generation by the female, because you only inherit you only inherit mitochondria from your mother as opposed to the father. So that means that these protective traits can only then be transmitted through the maternal line. So it's quite a really interesting concept, where a mother that herself may have had problems as a fetus in utero knows about these problems and has evolved compensatory mechanisms to cope with this problem, and transmits that know-how through her mitochondria onto her offspring.
And at the risk of sounding a bit grandiose, I suppose you could say that our health is really tied to the human health of generations and generations which have therefore come before us,
Oh, completely. And this idea of developmental programming and how traits can be transmitted across generations, this idea of intergenerational programming really provides an explanation for that.
We're dependent on our fellow man for the way that our health materializes, and I think that's quite a powerful sort of thought to end on.
It is, because what I think this gives us a sort of an unrivaled opportunity, doesn't it? It if you think about it, it gives us the idea to, or it gives us the chance to modify the cardiovascular risk, if you like, not only of our children, but also of their children and their children's children. So it really is a very significant and potentially important idea for public health to adopt.
Dino, this has been eye-opening and really enjoyable, so thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Phagia podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then head to Spotify or iTunes to hear more.
As ever, we'd love to hear what you think, and you can reach us via our Facebook page or by email. See you next time.